Thanks for that very kind and generous introduction, Horace. I'm especially grateful to Horace and the Williams College Museum of Art and the wonderful assembly of students, staff, and faculty that I've been able to meet during my short time here. Your generosity has been invigorating, and I certainly look forward to continuing the conversation. I'll be speaking here this evening as someone who works across multiple disciplines, including philosophy, religion, and African American studies. So I guess my hope is to have a little something for everybody, which also means that I'm unlikely to satisfy anybody. Probably won't have enough history for the historians, nor enough argumentation for the philosophers, and I won't even torture myself with pretending to be an art critic, not in this space. If anything, I'll seek shelter with scholars of religion, since they are known to borrow from everybody else in the humanities and social sciences without having to claim anything as our own. So in trying to open the way for a conversation about ecological community, I think it's instructive here to admit up front that this is itself, a certain kind of abstraction, this notion of ecological community, at least in the sense that I mean the term. So by ecological community, I mean only to suggest a vision of a more just and less cruel mode of relationality and connectivity between humans, animals, and other earthly vibrances, including plants, trees, seas, soils, streams, and mountains, as well as the ever-expanding and eroding technologies that mediate our interactions with these forms of life. Again, this is in many ways an improbable kind of aspiration, this notion of ecological community. I'm not of the mind that we can discover some kind of inner harmony that already exists somewhere deep within nature or somewhere beyond our present notions of society, in part because nature, whatever one wishes to make of this term, already bears the violent footprint of various forms of ecological aggression and devastation. Likewise, human beings are creatures and subjects of nature. We are a part of it, even subject to it. We human beings are always already a part of these wider ecologies. And it's here in the midst of all the complication, this confusion, even this complicity, that I think our real work is to be done. So even saying all this, I think that engaging in the work of trying to glimpse, imagine, embrace, just yearn, the sheer act of yearning after a mode of living that is an alternative to what's already here. I think this is really, really important. So if there's a premise to this talk, it's this, that engaging in the task of envisioning an ever-revisable, necessarily partial, and piecemeal version of this aspiration matters, this aspiration toward what I'm calling somewhat clumsily ecological community. We need a sense of the alternatives before, within, and about us, not because we are sure to realize them, but so that we might have a more robust conversation about the terms of necessity, prudence, and efficiency which currently constrain our ability to live into alternative modes of life, to even desire something other than the idols to which we presently cling, something other than the ideologies and objects of affection that likewise have a hold on us. Is it really necessary to sacrifice as much as you or as much as we do in terms of our health and our relationships, our attentiveness to the vulnerable in our midst for the sake of a job or a position, for the sake of a job and a position or security that doesn't give you life, but outside of which you cannot even imagine life? This is what I have in mind when I talk of the need for alternative and the need to interrogate the peace with which we make with necessities necessities which might someday, given the right kind of crisis, be rendered optional, ridiculous. Now, in lifting up this idea of ecological community, I would be remiss not to acknowledge that the effort is fraught even to imagine this notion, this kind of ideal, in part because we have to confront the reality of unyielding injustices. And by unyielding injustices, I mean something like the structural assemblages and the institutional arrangements which largely determine how variously situated persons, folks who are race, gendered, classed, more or less able-bodied, are forced to navigate their lives, which is also to say their proximity to death and other forms of maiming, their access to clean water and adequate health care, their proximity to toxic waste, their vulnerability to bodily encroachment, sexual violation, and physical harm, threat, or harassment, or their subjection to predatory lending practices and unfair workplace treatment, their likelihood of being incarcerated, disenfranchised, the object of state-sanctioned brutality, invasion, and surveillance, and often we see these days with impunity. So the language of resilient injustice tries to capture the sense in which persons and groups are subject to the arbitrary will of others. And of course, this isn't just a story about the United States. Practices of domination are geopolitical in their reach, extending beyond national boundaries, stretching across oceans, even into them, across continents and hemispheres. These days, it's hard not to be depressed if you care about justice and freedom. If you're Black in America, or poor, or woman, or queer, or trans, it's not simply that you have to move through a world which in its design, in its very infrastructure, in its landscape, constantly tries to undo or underpay or punish even your most efforts. It's not just that. We do well to remember that the stress of living through such a world actually wreaks havoc on the body. Racism, for example, literally makes Black people physically sicker. In this way, the resiliency of injustice isn't just institutional, it's embodied, it's carried and encoded into the DNA, passed on from generation to generation. Trauma has generational effects. Eric Garner, for example, was murdered by a police officer in the summer of 2014. And instead of being convicted of a crime, his killer kept his job for the next 5 years. In response to this injustice, Erica Garner, the daughter of Eric, chose to organize against the practices and institution which sanctioned the death of her father. And she did this, mind you, at the risk of her own health. 3 years after the death of her father, Erica Garner died of a heart attack in December of 2017, 2 years before her father's killer would lose his job. And though Erica Garner didn't die in the hands of a state-sanctioned officer, she did die in part because of state-authorized racism. I'm struggling right now with the stress and everything, she said just weeks before suffering a heart attack. This thing, it beats you down. The system beats you down where you can't win, unquote. So institutional racism attacks the bodies of those who bear its weight long after the initial blow or chokehold or prison sentence occurs. This too is what I mean to convey by the idea of aspiring toward more just and wholesome forms of ecological relationality. It's not just proximity to waste and unclean water that destroys marginalized communities. It's the weight and stress of living under these conditions that also destroys. Howard Thurman, a 20th century religious thinker who figures prominently in this lecture today, put the point this way: the bodies of Negroes remember, and their psyches can never forget this vast desecration of personality. So it's within this context of overwhelming forms of ecological, social justice, that I want to make the case for this more expansive account of ecological community. I want to say a bit about how we might envision it, how it might be enacted in our scholarship and teaching, and how we might express it in our friendships, allyships, and political solidarities. I won't get into the extent to which the vision that I offer is extremely fraught, but I will just gesture toward a number of challenges. One of the challenges with a call to lean into deeper, more wholesome forms of relationality is something like this. It's an issue that flows from many of the unyielding injustices that I just mentioned, and the ways in which they are inscribed on the body and within the spaces that mediate our relationships to one another. So one of the ways in which, it's hard to say if they're well-meaning or not, but let's just say efforts to arrive at a sort of kind of community can go awry, is through the effort to draw something like historical analog or connections, when in fact that claim to connectivity does not hold and actually assumes a sort of equivocation. And so one example here would be someone like Wendell Berry in his text, The Unsettling of America, where he's going to draw the parallel between revolutionaries fighting against the British Crown and what indigenous persons went through when they were attacked. And these things are not the same, but he equivocates in the attempt to sort of establish a certain kind of community. I mean, the other is something more basic, which really involves the difficulty of encountering otherness, difference, with an openness to transformation, but with an openness to transformation that is not over-determined by hegemonic desires of consumption or incorporation, or something like gendered or racialized claims of possession. What does it mean to encounter that which does not belong to you, but that which may well promise to transform you? These are real challenges to this notion of ecological community. Nevertheless, I still want to argue that our practices of care and our habits of criticism significantly bear on how we can understand these various injustices. And so I want to argue that the quality of this awareness, this ecological attentiveness, matters for those of us who are interested in contending with this kind of resiliency. In this sense, I think that the political and ethical wisdom of Howard Thurman and James Baldwin matters now, in part more than ever, precisely because they speak to this constellation of problems. So first, I want to speak to the ways in which I think Howard Thurman offers a response to the kind of pessimism that's taken hold in certain quarters of popular African-American thought these days. And secondly, I want to show how I think James Baldwin responds to a certain set of political problems which lie at the intersection of self and social care, identity politics, and political insurgency, all of which are going to be central to any practice of re-envisioning the terms of ecological community. So first, Howard Thurman's sort of response to a kind of pessimism. Ibram Kendi, an African-American intellectual and historian, author of the award-winning book Stamped from the Beginning, recently made the following claim a few years back. He writes, "We have been taught that ignorance and hate led to racist ideas, led to racist policies. So that if the fundamental problem is ignorance and hate, then your solutions are going to be focused on education and love and persuasion. But of course, Stamped from the Beginning shows that the actual foundation of racism is not ignorance and hate, but self-interest, particularly economic and political and cultural. For Kendi and other intellectual projects, if they are to be effective, we should focus our attempt on the design of better policies. Fresh educational efforts, appeals to character, and persuasive argumentation have proven, on their view, to be inadequate and ineffective, namely because they don't get to the foundation of inequality, self-interest. But what Kendi, to my mind, doesn't appreciate is that well-crafted policies which aim to adequately meet the needs of ordinary, vulnerable persons in all of their complexity that cannot be divorced from the various ways they inhabit landscape. This kind of attentiveness will require all kinds of sensitivity and care, especially on the part of the folks who would take themselves to be designing such policies. Furthermore, the folks who vote on instituting the policies will need to be persuaded of its merits, plausibility, and therefore its values. Beyond this, the persons who are actually charged to carry out these policy objectives will need to do so in a spirit that's sensitive to the needs of those who are being served, so that the issue of something like cruelty and blindness and various forms of callousness is not easily evaded. So while I agree that merely focusing on something like education, moral reformation, and love certainly has its limits, the very outcomes that Kendi and others seem to prize, in my mind, already suppose the kind of knowledge, care, and persuasion that they want to resist. Now, a second concern from certain black intellectuals comes from those who tend to offer a kind of totalizing account of, in this case, the black condition. These accounts tend to snuff out or underemphasize subversive strategies of organizing and thriving, even in the face of terrible odds. So on my reading, part of the appeal of someone like Ta-Nehisi Coates' best-selling essay, Between the World and Me, is the purported refusal to revere the gods that many Americans have traditionally worshiped. Those objects of misplaced devotion for Coates include democracy, racism, the myth of progress, American exceptionalism, the dream, as he often calls it. But Coates also expresses a reverence for the hopeful ideals and aspirations that many black Americans hold dear, including their gods. So not only does his writing sound a profoundly irreligious note, it's also deeply pessimistic. Or to be more precise, Coates can be read as politically falling somewhere between deeply pessimistic and being simply realistic, depending on one's political orientation. Black freedom dreams of justice, equality, and full citizenship in his hands are often construed as ideologically disastrous, bad counsel for the coming generation, foolish advice even for his own son. In effect, Between the World and Me proffers a politics of the clear-sighted without the blinding effect of these ideals. For many readers, and this is a danger that I want to highlight, the intensity of Coates' irreverence serves as a badge of its extraordinary vision. We might say the same about the allure of certain renderings of Afro-pessimism. And so here the worry is that there's a tendency in the light of all of the overwhelming evidence, the overwhelming odds, there's a tendency to say that, to say out of hand what is already not possible, what is already worth imagining, without fully grappling with the significance of the radical imagination itself, particularly at the level of considering alternatives, and thereby further positioning us as a way to lean into a different mode of living. All this is to say is that these sorts of critiques for me, while of theoretical interest for many academics, this is not, in my reading of history, the practical attitude that folks interested in transforming and remaking the world can actually afford to take up. This mode of thinking also doesn't give attention to the very human ways in which marginalized persons have cared for one another, often in the light of what they consider to be human, just, and lovely. The intellectual stakes of beginning one's analysis with the conditions of black insurgent vitality, instead of presuming or assuming the primacy of black death, are immense. The same, I want to suggest, can be said about our practices of love, knowledge, and persuasion. and the temptation to jettison their significance. To take seriously how life is presently gathering together is to begin to take seriously how black folks and other marginalized folks have practically, not just theoretically, but practically managed to thrive and to fight for their lives. This is precisely what Howard Thurman tried to do with his life. He was not merely a theorist of Black death. He was a living practitioner working to kindle the flames of spirit and organized agitation. Thurman was a spiritual mentor to a generation of civil rights activists, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was born at the dawn of the 20th century in Daytona, Florida, and he took as his vocation to be that of a pastor, minister. He worked with countless churches, students at Oberlin, Morehouse, Spelman, later Howard, as well as BU. He would go on to establish the first interdenominational and interracial church in this country. And he would eventually also serve as a mentor to Martin Luther King Jr. at Boston University. While most of us are familiar with King far more than Thurman, King borrowed much of his love talk. If you sort of read the two, alongside one another, you can see in many cases, very similar phrasing. So he borrows a lot of his love language from Thurman. But Thurman chose not to be at the forefront of the civil rights movement, which is not to say that he did not play a role. And here, I think, is another reason to consider Thurman's example, that there are a diversity of ways to affect change, not all of which involve celebrity, status, and publicity. Our ethical projects of self-formation are always bound to political practices of organizing persons, powers, and interests. And since it's possible to organize better or worse ways of freedom and justice-making, we do well to consider the character of the persons who make such efforts. Social movements depend on the persons who sustain them, their resolve and spirit, their organized demands for power and justice, the proper ordering of their loves, priorities, as well as the unleashing of their aptly channeled anger. Thurman, in this regard, was primarily concerned with the souls of the disinherited, with the quality of their hearts, minds, and imaginations. So in this respect, like Coates and other Afro-pessimists, Thurman maintained a deep suspicion of various claims to American exceptionalism, and yet he still offered a kind of vision for the future. He criticized the God of white Christianity, and yet still advocated for a deeper form of religiosity. In short, Thurman shows why we ought to be wary of privileging impiety as an end in itself. Deconstruction, I want to suggest, is not an advisable way of life all alone. It's also essential that we actually be for something substantial, not just that we rail against the tyrant or hegemon. And of course, for the post-structuralists on this side of Foucault, very, very, very hard to posit ideals. There's a lot of nervousness around what it means to even trot out a thick notion like goodness or something, because it's often the site where power consolidates itself. Who gets to determine the content of that, right? I sense the danger, and yet I still want, we don't have to call it ecological community, but I still want my ideal. So in this way, Thurman invites us to think carefully about the way that our ideals, whether it's freedom, justice, ecological community, God, are constantly subject to revision and reappraisal. We imperfectly embody and inhabit these aspirations as we stretch toward them. If the politics of impiety significantly involves a political and ethical way of inhabiting the present, then we do well to assess how its consequences bear on our way of living, not simply for the sake of the persons and social movements presupposed by such vitality, but also for the sake of those that they would usher into existence. Not simply for the sake of the persons who are already here, engaging in that kind of vitality, but also for the sake of those that they would usher into existence. That is to say, what does it mean to not bequeath to those who are coming after us a sense of what is possible? Robust set of resources to engage in otherwise possibilities. So So in this sense, and this is really sort of the crux of my engagement with Thurman and James Baldwin, both of these thinkers care about the consequences of our habits of formation and also the power of our capacities of imagination. The consequences of our habits of formation and also the power of our capacities of imagination. And it's here at this intersection where you'll see the sort of the imprint of these unyielding injustices and the way in which they have everything to do with how, not only how we've already been formed, but with respect to the various modes of life and disfigured forms of relationality that are forming us right now. So what does Thurman have to say that might be of use today? Just a few quotes. Love loves, that's its nature. But this does not mean that love is blind, naive, or pretentious. It does mean that love holds its object securely in its grasp, calling all that it sees by its true name, but surrounding all with the wisdom born both of its passion and its understanding. Now, for me, this is a really important passage here because it unites sort of our practices of knowing with our practices of caring. And oftentimes we can inhabit various intellectual spaces that would render our practices of knowing merely in terms of something like cognition, merely in terms of belief and not in terms of affect. And so for Thurman, the two are intimately bound up with one another. Practices of knowing and caring. And also for Thurman, these are mediated by the imagination. Another passage. Very glibly, we are apt to use such words as sympathy, compassion, sitting where they sit. But in experience, it is genuinely to be rocked to one's foundations. We resist making room for considerations that will bend us out of the path of preoccupation with ourselves, our needs, our problems. We corrupt our imagination when we give it range over only our own affairs. Here we experience the magnification of our own wills, the distortion of our own problems, and the enlargement of the areas of our misery. The activity of which we deprive our imagination in the work of understanding others turns in upon ourselves with disaster and sometimes terror. One more. I must find the opening or openings through which my love can flow into the life of the other, and at the same time locate in myself openings through which that love can flow into me. What then does this negotiation of knowing, caring, and imagination look like for Howard Thurman? This is what he says, and this idea will frame my turn to James Baldwin. As Thurman put it, he says, we are all artists in the sense that we are all engaged in some kind of activity by which we are realizing our ideals. What kinds of ideals are you realizing? There is no neutrality here, he says. We are all engaged in this activity. Is what you are realizing worthy of you, or are you ashamed of what it is that you are presently realizing? Now, part of what Thurman thinks will be required for the sort of transformational change that he wants to locate at the heart of our practices of formation and our capacities of imagination, the way in which he's going to flesh out these practices of formation involve what he calls the disciplines of the body and spirit. We can talk about that in the Q&A. But the other way in which he wants to sort of flesh out the sort of role of the imagination here is to say that transformation doesn't occur merely with the presentation of facts or pontifications about morality. What we need for transformation is to have our wills aroused by a motivating ideal or a vision that inspires. We need to be informed with kaleidoscopic ways of knowing that also drip with power and passion. Visions that breathe life. Now, as I see it, I think this is precisely part of the work of artistic exemplars. Not only do they engage in what Howard Thurman calls the fine art of living, they also render performance and portraits of this fine art. That can awaken, inspire, and arouse our wills. For this reason, I think it's a grave mistake to separate ethics, philosophy, politics, and ecology from the very significant and indispensable contributions of artists. With this query in mind, I now turn to the work of James Baldwin. Now, in turning to the work of James Baldwin, part of what I want to do here is retrieve the language of self-care and self-formation for this recast political vision centered around ecological attunement that I've been talking about. Now, one of the reasons why I want to retrieve this language of self-care has to do with everything that I mentioned regarding resilient injustices in the early part of the talk. That is to say, folks are wounded and hurting, and it's simply not it's not feasible, nor is it possible to imagine some kind of heroic, ongoing encounter with these various forms of devastation. And so we're going to have to find ways to renew ourselves in this struggle and this strength, and that's going to have to happen within the context of community. So I want to retrieve the language of self-care and its power for politics, because I think that the capacity to care for oneself during these times is actually vital for political struggle and for the kind of ecological attunement and resolve that I've been trying to grow toward. Now, in turning to this language of self-care, I won't get into the details. We can talk more about it, but I have in mind some of the later lectures of Michel Foucault in the 80s, where he refers to something like techniques of the self in spiritual disciplines. These are activities that one might engage in with the help of a guide or a mentor. Activities like the reading and memorization of certain texts, various ascetic practices, and so forth. I also want to add sort of various encounters with works of art into sort of this process and practice of self and social care. Now, these engagements usually take place with the help of another person, and their aim is to prepare one to be able to live into one's own freedom, however this freedom gets construed. Now, to my mind, I think this is precisely the model of artistic, moral formation that we find in a figure like James Baldwin, who himself is initiated into various practices of self, social, and ecological care. And this happens precisely through his relationship with a man and an artist he described as his spiritual mentor, Buford Delaney. In order to see what's at stake in this emphasis, I want to turn very briefly to a passage from James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain, and then I'll turn to what Baldwin says of Delaney's impact on his life, and then I'll rush to my conclusion. So this passage that I'm about to read highlights the difficulty of searching out the terms upon which we are connected to other possibilities which seem at a glance to be far off, the terms upon which we are connected to possibilities which may well seem unknowable, not worthy of our time and attention. So in this passage that I'm about to read, the protagonist, John Grimes, finds himself in a world that Baldwin describes as narrow and dirty, where nothing seemed to alter its dimensions. This was a world where living well seemed impossible, a world where joy seemed unthinkable, and the experience of awe seemed unknowable. Of the place that John Grimes called home, Baldwin writes that dirt was in the walls and on the floorboards, and triumphed beneath the sink where roaches spawn. Dirt was in the fine ridges of the pots and pans, scoured daily, burnt black on the bottom, hanging above the stove. Dirt was in the wall against which they hung, and revealed itself where the paint had cracked and leaned outward in stiff squares and fragments. Dirt was in every corner, angle, crevice of the monstrous stove, and lived behind it in delirious communion with the corrupted wall. Dirt was in the baseboard that John scrubbed every Saturday, and dirt roughened the cupboard shelves that held the cracked and gleaming dishes. Under this dark weight, the walls leaned, and under it, the ceiling also sagged. And whenever John Grimes tried to clean or sweep up the dirt, he seemed to get dirtier. As he swept, the dust rose, clogging his nose and sticking to his sweaty skin, and he felt that should he sweep forever, the clouds of dust would not diminish, for the room would not be clean. But here's the turn, and this is the fascinating passage. But then John Grimes noticed, which on my interpretation is to say, he was more attuned. He became aware. But then John noticed how the windows gleamed like beaten gold or silver, and for the first time, he saw in the yellow light how fine dust veiled their doubtful glory. How fine dust veiled the doubtful glory of the frames through which he was encountering the world, windows through which the world and its yellow light was now beaming in upon him. So the question I want to ask with this image in mind is this: what are the conditions, the habits, the processes of formation that allow for this keenness of sensitivity in the midst of overwhelming odds? How do we account for this kind of ecological attunement? How does one come to an awareness of the ways in which fine dust can veil doubtful glory? How do we as human beings become more attuned to the potential that hides in unseemly places, as Baldwin put it, in muddy potholes, urine-stained halls, or dust-coated corners? How might we refashion our sense of dirt and disposability in a world where grime seemingly threatens to entrap us at every turn? If all is lost, then why even try? Ecological nihilism awaits where there is no meaning, no hope. And this is an option that Baldwin steadily refuses, even though he is consistently tempted by it. And I think his artistic and spiritual and moral and political struggle to confront the reality of these seemingly unyielding injustices with this kind of resolve is instructive for us. Now, to understand the development of Baldwin's capacities of discernment is to understand his artistic journey. Grasping this lesson involves appreciating the role of his spiritual father, the man who taught him to see the sublime in the ordinary, the artist who taught him to search for the presence of light amid darkness. This was Buford Delaney. And Buford's paintings, it's worth noting, often cast Baldwin himself in yellow light. If there was a safe image to project in this space, I suppose it was one of Buford Delaney's renderings of James Baldwin. I could have put that up. Felt pretty confident about myself. So in his introduction to The Price of the Ticket, published in 1983, Baldwin describes the beginning of his writing career as coinciding with the meeting of the man he affectionately called Buford. When recalling his first meeting with Buford as a teenager, Jimmy remembered the discerning glance of a short, round, brown man who possessed, and I quote, "the most extraordinary eyes I'd ever seen." For Baldwin, the intensity of Buford's gaze seemed like an X-ray of my brain, lungs, liver, heart, bowels, and spinal cord. In the years to come, Baldwin would grow to understand that the intensity of Buford was actually an act of love, of Buford's impassioned way of being in the world. Through Buford's tutelage, Baldwin came to appreciate the significance of color and music, of sight and sound. Stepping into Buford's home at the age of 15, Baldwin says, was a religious-like experience. He opened the door all right, Baldwin writes, and I walked through that door into Buford's colors, on the easel, on the palette, against the wall, sometimes turned to the wall, and sometimes in limbo covered by white sheets. Baldwin would also come to appreciate music in the midst of this mentor. Here again, the choice of language is significant, where Baldwin describes himself as journeying into another world, as well as the image of his being immersed in it. I walked into the music, Baldwin says. I had grown up with music, but now on Buford's small black record player, I began to hear what I had never dared or even been able to hear. I really began to hear Ella Fitzgerald, Ma Rainey, Louis Armstrong, Bessie Smith, Ethel Waters, Paul Robeson, Lena Horne, Fats Waller. He can inform me about Duke Ellington and W.C. Handy, and these people were not meant to be looked on by me as celebrities, but as a part of Buford's life and now as a part of my inheritance. Buford also taught Baldwin how to relate to the wider spheres of life and darkness from which his painting sprang. Perhaps, Baldwin wondered, I am so struck by the light in Buford's paintings because he comes from darkness as I do, as in fact we all do. This heightened awareness would extend beyond the world of black performers and artists and into the everyday offerings of nature and the casual routines of ordinary folks. But Baldwin couldn't actually see the character of Buford's paintings until he learned how to relate to these worlds of experience. Buford was his discerning guide, his mentor, his teacher in the way of self and ecological care, such that the reality of Buford's seeing, Baldwin says, actually caused me to begin to see. As Baldwin put it, now what I began to see was not at that time, to tell the truth, his painting, that came later. What I saw, first of all, was a brown leaf on black asphalt, oil moving like mercury in the black water of the gutter, grass pushing itself up through a crevice in the sidewalk. The brown leaf on the black asphalt, for example, what colors were these really? To stare at the leaf long enough to try to apprehend the leaf was to discover many colors in it. And though black had been described to me as the absence of light, it became very clear to me that if this were true, we would never have been able to see the color black. The light is trapped in it and struggles upward, rather like that grass pushing upward through the cement. It was humbling to be forced to realize that the light fell down from heaven on everything, on everybody, and that light was always changing. The rolling variations within our ordinary encounters and the sea of revelations they contain, this is what Buford Delaney helped Baldwin see. And yet, these offerings for Baldwin depended on whether a person could face reality, on whether or not he or they or we could take the long, discerning look. That's what Buford's lesson in artistic discernment did for Baldwin. They brought him closer to this reality, and I venture to suggest it's what Baldwin would have hoped his work would have accomplished for us. Of Baldwin's aesthetic and ethical effort to cast light and channel love, I find it apt to quote what he finally says of Buford. Well, that life, that light, that miracle are what I began to see in Buford's paintings, and this light began to stretch back for me all over the time we had known each other, and over much more than that. And this light held the power to illuminate, even to redeem and reconcile and heal. And the beauty of his triumph, and the proof that it is a real one, is that he makes it ours. Perhaps I should not say flatly what I believe, that he is a great painter among the very greatest, but I do know that great art can only be created out of love, and that no greater love has ever held a brush. On my view, this kind of care that Buford helped to bequeath Baldwin as a young teenager is precisely the kind of care, the kind of attentiveness that Baldwin was attempting to pass on to his nephew James at the beginning of The Fire Next Time. I'm happy to talk more about sort of how I see Baldwin in many ways serving as a mentor who's trying to invite this younger generation into a way of looking, a way of feeling, a way of being, by way of the intimacy, the artistry of the epistle, the letter. In 1987, when commemorating the power of Baldwin's life in eulogy, the late Toni Morrison noted Baldwin's significance as an artist, writer, and friend. She described Baldwin's offerings, embodied and written as gifts of love. Among her most treasured gifts, she says, were Baldwin's language, courage, and his tenderness. Through them, Morrison came to care for herself and her world a bit better. Like many of us left here, I thought I knew you, she writes to Baldwin, but now I discover that in your company, it is myself I know. So that the gift of Baldwin's self was the gift of one to oneself, and the gift of Baldwin's prose was also the gift of truth and freedom. Writing of, to, and through her friend, Morrison affirms that no one possessed or inhabited language for me the way you did. You made American English honest, genuinely international. You stripped it of ease and false comfort and fake innocence and evasion and hypocrisy, and in place of deviousness was clarity. In place of soft, plump lies was a lean, targeted power. You replaced lumbering platitudes with an upright elegance. You went into the forbidden territory, decolonized it, robbed it of the jewel of its naivete, and ungated it for black people, so that in your wake, notice here, sort of, to be in the wake, notice the way in which Morrison here is associating wake with life. Often the wake these days is associated with captivity and death. She says, in your wake, we could enter it, occupy it, restructure it in order to accommodate our complicated passions, not our vanities, but our intricate, difficult, demanding beauty, our tragic, insistent knowledge, our lived reality. She goes on and on and on. All this is to say that Baldwin enabled Morrison, on my reading, and countless others to perceive their possibilities more imaginatively. And this came by way of a kind of artistic care and attentiveness to the formation of others, not just to the pursuit of something like standing or prestige. By extension, I think as readers of Morrison and Baldwin and Thurman and King, I think that this set of figures and the kind of tradition and the practices of formation and the ways in which they invite the expansion and the enlargement of our imaginations is likewise instructive and potentially transformative for all of us. Which is to say that to properly care for oneself in the most robust sense of the practice is, in my mind, to consider one's ecological connections and imbrications with other forms of life. It is to live in and through the sources of one's own life and the lives of those who are coming after you. The ecological vision I've been trying to suggest is an invitation to engage in just that kind of work. At the beginning of his wonderful book, Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, historian Robin D.G. Kelley poses a question that I've tried to take seriously this evening. How do we produce a vision that enables us to see beyond our immediate ordeals? How do we transcend bitterness and cynicism and embrace love, hope, and an all-encompassing dream of freedom, especially in these rough times? What I've tried to suggest is that it can only take place within the context of a lived community of care and support with the resources of various artistic, political, and ethical traditions. Thurman and Baldwin both alert us to the necessity of treating these traditions and practices, these artistic traditions and practices, as serious objects of intellectual and political inquiry. Only out of that shared life can we hope to fashion the kinds of ideals that are worthy of our pursuit, perhaps even our sacrifice. The bodies of Negroes remember not simply the wounds of their struggle, but the power of life gathering together in the wake of others. Ecological resolve in the face of resilient injustice requires the acknowledgement of an assembly of care within the context of community. Thank you.
Thank you all so very much for coming. Clifton went to get a little bit of water, but I thought that I would raise up two things he said. We can chat for a little bit, he can come back, join, and then you can join as well. I was deeply struck by the sense of stratagems and communities of knowing, stratagems and communities of care. That formulation, I feel, at its very heart and nexus, when it beats with life and truth, is what museums strive to be. Places of deep knowledge, places of deep care, for both sides of the equation, objects and people and ideas, right? That's what we strive to do. It's what academic museums are specifically and uniquely situated to be and to build with their communities. I also really just love James Baldwin and Buford Delaney. There's something so beautiful, particularly in the month of February, and thinking about Buford Delaney and the ways in which, as an artist, museums, I would argue, in the past 15 years are beginning to deeply attend to Buford's legacy. And we do not have a stunning, glowing Buford Delaney of Baldwin or of Marian Anderson, as some of you might have seen, but we do have a lovely Buford Delaney watercolor, which is quite special, So thank you, Clifton. Thank you. Please.
I'll start. Thank you so much for that really beautiful and inspiring talk. I hope I don't misquote you, but you said something along the lines of, what does it mean to encounter what doesn't belong to you, but may very well transform you? And thinking about what Horace just said and where we are, I couldn't help but think of museums, all of these objects that we have here at WICMA, almost 15,000 don't belong to any one of us, and many of them were acquired through less than just means. Yet at the same time, this museum is full of people that want to kind of bequeath that sense of what is possible, to use your own words, and kind of have that sense of care and have visions that are dripping with passion. So I'm wondering your thoughts on kind of what the potentials are for a public museum to render that kind of experience that Baldwin had of being inspired by art, of learning from art, and letting a collection of art that's acquired through various means kind of give love and give a sense of community.
Yes, thanks for the question. It's a difficult one. What I would say is that I'm not of the mind that there's really any purity to be found, so that even when we consider, an institution like the university, for example, these spaces are, very fraught histories, but you don't quite find the kind of indignation surrounding universities in the way that it might be with the museum, right? But they're also fraught, and institutions of hierarchy and all kinds of injustice and erasure and theft at the heart of many of these places. So I think it's about trying to engage in a kind of historical accounting and owning and reckoning and then keeping track of the complicities that are ongoing, keeping track of the forces that are in many ways necessitating whatever the terms of action are at the moment, and not refusing to be attached to those concessions, refusing the temptation to treat those concessions as if they actually are worthwhile. And so there's a refusal to identify fully with the prudential or proximate activity that one has to engage in to kind of even be in the space, and maintaining an allegiance to something that's much larger, far more capacious. So it's the fine art of holding those two in tension, I think would be my response.
Okay. I was wondering, I was really fascinated near the end of your talk when you were speaking about intergenerational dialogues, especially with the relationship to the writers that you were speaking about. And I see museums as a really interesting combination of intergenerational dialogues that we've sort of inherited. But thinking about alternative spaces for creating those dialogues, I'm wondering if you could speak a bit more about experiences that you've had through your work as a scholar, but also in life as well, of creating intergenerational dialogues through art or through reading, through writing, and the sort of power of that. I think a lot of us see repeated a lot that we're living in an exceptionally crazy time, an exceptional moment, and I think a lot of that dialogue verges on forms of American exceptionalism, and also, you don't want to equate pasts with the present either, but there's sort of a need to reckon with them at the same time. So I was wondering if you could speak more about alternative modes of intergenerational dialogue.
Yes, it's a great question, and I think my talk tried to address it in terms of this idea of piety, the just acknowledgement of the sources of one's own existence and progress through life, and that can always be a fraught process of acknowledging what has gone into the making of your life. I mean, Baldwin puts it this way early on in Notes of a Native Son. He says, "I can't separate the things that help me from those that hurt." And I would say that so many times the kind of intergenerational conflict has a lot to do with woundedness and just the human difficulty of holding in view the people, traditions, and experiences that were bound up maybe with sort of love and care as someone understood it, but that also might have been painful, but that may have helped in some ways. I mean, it's just really hard to make sense of all of that, and it's just going to take a whole assembly of folks to help us work through it. That's all I have on that. I'm going to pass the mic. You want to respond to that?
Oh, absolutely not. I couldn't begin to.
No, I'm not responding. I was just looking at when you asked, and I was like, we are so thankful that so many of our colleagues, both students, undergrad and grad, faculty and staff, came out and are here. And so I'm looking across the room and I'm noticing some staff who, on a daily basis, navigate both in the classroom, in office hours, and in walking through this community, those moments when we could say failure actually gives the best lesson. We could say moments where what is that feeling if it's not perfection? So what is it if it's not perfection? It's still good. And I'm wondering if there are people in the audience who jive and feel and feel like they want to respond to that sense of how does one intergenerationally deal with these questions of deep frisson and deep concern. Yeah. Feeling it is also a response. Yeah. Yes, Elise, would you like to?
Sure. So I was thinking a lot during your talk about the type of community that we need to build to make the serious changes that are required to prevent disaster at this point. ecological, and so many other forms of injustice alike. And I was thinking about the ways in which we really need to get every single person on board in order to make the difference we need to make to stop the change from happening that will ultimately consume us all. And I guess I was thinking about how we go about including those in the sort of ecological community who might not buy into the sort of moments with art or with religion, or who choose to consume those types of things in a more passive way or a less critical way, or who simply aren't thinking about them in terms of their capacity to change. How we go about including those people who might be, for instance, CEOs of companies that their decision making might impact us more than all of us in this room getting up and doing 100 things every day. I don't know if that coalesced into a question at the end, but how do we include them? There's the question.
I wonder if we can enjoin that excellent question with the sense of what Clifton gave us about being an ecological community means the discerning look and kind of a life of artistry and artistic community and what that gives in terms of refinement and questioning, and to your point, Eliza, that sense of that double-edged sword of exceptionalism. And what it means to make change that's based on self-care but also community care, which is a deep refining of the ways we spend and expend, and a deep coalescing around discernment. I look at the photographs on the wall and I think, our question, what is a landscape? It is many things, but it is a discerning look.
I really appreciate the question. I would also say that there's a way in which one of the pieces today that we read in class, talked about sort of crisis as a springboard for a particular kind of artistic energy. So that there was a decisive sort of break or moment of rupture, and then something new was born. And so I think that there's that aspect to production and creativity that's sensitive to the times, whatever they are. But then there's also an aspect of creativity, and I still want to be open to mystery and stuff like this. I don't want to put too big of a name on it, but I want to be open to mystery, and I think that we engage in work that the world may not be prepared for. And so we may write for or create for viewers or audiences that have yet to come into being. And there is a sense in which there are, we have these artistic and prophetic exemplars who somehow we know that they are part of our past inheritance, and yet it feels as if they're in the future still waiting on us. We're still trying to catch up. And I think there's that element too. And I would say the danger is always one of concession, of conceding the terms of the status quo merely to be effective, or merely to be legible, or merely to be paid. Whatever to be paid, or whatever the lure.
I don't have a question formulated right now, but we'll get, this is where my head's at. So towards the end of the talk, you were using the word wake in a positive manner, in that wake was imbued with life. And Horace has heard me talk about this at length, but the work of Christina Sharp in The Wake on Blackness and Being has been fresh in my mind because I think I too approached care with a pessimistic mood at the beginning, but once I hit that work, it was like the word wake was doing so much work. Yes, it is the moment left after the boat that we wade through historically, that we're just kind of moving through, and it's mushy and it's moving us backwards. But wake is also a consciousness rising, right? And we use it sometimes to be like fake woke or like woke check and use it like that in that manner. But there's also like the awakening of something within us. So I just really appreciate you bringing us back to the same kind of ideas can be used in so many different ways. Ecologies are made into communities, are made into different practices on a daily basis, whether you wake up, take a shower, all these things. But I just appreciate your talk for being encompassing of both positives and negatives, both the light and the dark. That is no question, but an affirmation and a thank you, and an opening up to the rest of the audience if they would like to join in.
How are the hearts and minds out there? Anything on the tip of the tongue, anything at the palm, at the ready, at the quick, that feels one's utterance? A question, a statement, a ponder.
Thank you so much. That was really lovely. I guess something that struck me quite a bit was the beautiful passage that you read about the grime and the dirt and in the window. And what it reminded me of was there's a passage in something by Derrida where he talks about looking at the world through a veil of tears, and that is actually maybe the best way to look at the world, through a veil of tears, which can signify compassion, it can signify dirt. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the idea of the inability or failure to quote unquote see clearly as being something that is actually a mode of resilience and cultural resistance, and the way in which communities can build off of something, going back to the previous conversation, that at first glance seems like a failing.
I missed the very end of the question. At first glance,
Seems like a failing, like that there's an inability.
yeah. There's always this. There's this passage at the beginning of Baldwin's Fire Next Time. He's writing to his nephew, and he talks about his nephew's father and how how he still senses the invisible tears of his brother. And I don't know what to make of that, but I think it's related to what you're suggesting, something around ambiguity. It's the possibility of a form of knowing that may well not be self-conscious for the subject that's under review. So you see a veil of tears, and then tears that are real but not yet wet, or not yet visible, or not yet material. And I mean that's an attunement to suffering that may well be ineffable, not just at the level of language, but even at the level of bodily expression. And it's not a world that I'm familiar with. I don't live there, you know, but I want to be open to what it means to consider these sorts of realities. And what, you know, and then when you throw in the gender and bodies and so, you know, who's permitted to cry, who's permitted to grieve, and the way in which that's bound up with masculinity and all, it's very fraught. Very fraught.
That's such a startling and stunning and cogently phrased question, Emma, and I think one to lead us out into tonight with. I'm thinking about Du Bois and Dark Water, thinking about the first time we went to Germany and saw the cathedral meeting and said, out of a veil of tears, I opened the hand of the world. I'm thinking about our dear friend William Starby English and his book, How the Seal Worked, and Total Blackness. And even as Darby is wrestling legacies of liberation and abstraction by Black artists, that sense of seeing the world through a veil of tragic beauty, and viewing the canvas with the scarification of trauma. And yet, this is not Black work, it's not American work, it is the pure work of brilliance and genius. And I think it's simple. We will at this stage in our lives be wrestling with Thank you all so very much for coming. Thank you, Dr. Granby. Thank you to the incredible grad students I get to hang out with every week. And thank you all for